So the US Supreme Court just heard oral arguments in a critical Second Amendment case, which essentially threatens to shut down the entire firearms industry nationwide. So let's break down what happened today in front of the Supreme Court. Now, really quick before we jump into this video, I want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Brownells. You guys know that Brownells is an amazing company. They support the Second Amendment. They support what we do here on the channel. So again, I just wanted to thank Brownells for sponsoring this type of 2A content. And if you guys are interested, check them out and you can use the code SCHOLAR10 for 10% off of any orders. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be breaking down a very significant Second Amendment case which was just heard in front of the Supreme Court this morning. The case is Smith & Wesson versus the nation of Mexico. And in this case, a group of the largest firearms manufacturers, which include Smith & Wesson, Barrett, Century Arms, Colt, Glock, Ruger, and many more, were sued by the nation of Mexico. Mexico is suing these companies in an attempt to hold them liable for harms that were caused by cartels in the nation of Mexico. This whole case revolves around the PLCAA, also known as the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, and essentially whether or not Mexico and potentially other individuals and other groups can sue gun companies and the industry and try to hold them liable for third-party criminal conduct. Mexico sued these companies and claims that there was about $238 billion in damages to Mexico, and they're seeking about $10 billion in compensation in damages through this lawsuit. They're also asking for injunctive relief in the form of America imposing new gun control measures in the United States and essentially restricting the sale of rifles and magazines. So they're trying to use this lawsuit to pass national gun bans, national rifle bans, national magazine bans. And again, they're using this lawsuit as a vehicle to force that. Now, this case was originally filed and heard in a district court in Massachusetts. And on review, the district court did the right thing. It dismissed this case under the PLCAA. And this, of course, generally bars these types of lawsuits from proceeding forward. However, Mexico then appealed that dismissal up to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. And on review, the First Circuit reversed that dismissal. They allowed this lawsuit to move forward. The First Circuit held that the PLCAA does not bar this suit because Mexico stated a claim that the defendants here, these gun companies, these gun manufacturers, engaged in business practices that have aided and abetted in firearms trafficking to cartels in the nation of Mexico, and those actions have proximately harmed the nation of Mexico. That, of course, is very concerning. So in response to that, these companies then sought Supreme Court review. They want the reversal of what the First Circuit said, and today the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in this case. So we need to break down what were kind of the main topics that were brought up during the arguments and maybe what I think the outcome of this is going to be. So the first thing I want to talk about, which was a big point that was discussed during the entire arguments, was the question of aiding and abetting. Did these gun manufacturers aid and abet in this type of criminal conduct? So the nation of Mexico is invoking criminal and federal aiding and abetting statutes to try to tie liability to these gun manufacturers. They claim that the manufacturers aided and abetted these retailers, these FFLs, who then sold those firearms illegally, maybe through straw purchases, or maybe, straw purchases happened, and then those firearms made their way into the nation of Mexico. Mexico claims that about 2% of all firearms sold by these manufacturers eventually find their way into Mexico. Now, a lot of the judges were asking, does that number really matter? Does the 2%, number that was brought up matter? If it was higher, would there be a liability for the gun companies? And the gun manufacturers claim that the number really doesn't matter when there are so many intervening independent criminal actions that cannot tie the gun manufacturers to the crime. Remember, there is an allegation that at some point there is a straw purchase that happens, maybe at a gun store, or maybe, the individual engages in a straw purchase that the FFL doesn't know about. And then that is transferred to an individual who isn't supposed to have the firearm. It is then smuggled illegally into the nation of Mexico. It is then handed over to the drug cartels who then, maybe use it in a crime, and that crime in some way harms the nation of Mexico. So you can see how there are so many intervening actions. And here the gun manufacturers say it doesn't matter what the percentage is. There are so many things that happen in these, causal link that we cannot be tied to what happens. There is also a question of, the nation of Mexico is assuming just because a gun is found at a crime scene in Mexico that it was sold illegally at some point from an FFL. They completely discount the fact that maybe a criminal, got those illegally, stole it. So there's a big assumption in this lawsuit where there is a straw purchase when actually it could have been acquired a completely different way and illegally. There was also a lot of discussion and another big point about no identified dealers for this whole causal link. Even Justice Kagan brought up that there are some conclusions and some allegations that are made in the complaint that don't really tell the justices or the court in general which dealers are maybe violating the laws. So she asked, which dealers, there's no specific identifications of the dealers in the lawsuit. And to this, and to rebut this, Mexico simply points to a Washington Post article that they have tied to their complaint. Justice Thomas also brought this up. He asked, have there been any violations that have been identified by the ATF, maybe pinpointed by the ATF, and has the ATF gone after those dealers? And, what the response of Mexico was is that no, the ATF doesn't have the resources. They can't identify all the dealers. And maybe that's why it's not included in the complaint. Now, the real surprise during this entire argument, I think, really was Justice Jackson. If you listen to some of the questions that she brought up, it seems that she is leaning against the nation of Mexico. At some point, she brings up, well, hasn't the PLCA actually taken off the table some of the analysis and some of the arguments that Mexico is bringing in this lawsuit? She points to statutory interpretation questions and says that maybe we need to understand what Congress actually meant and what they wanted as the narrow exceptions when they passed the PLCAA. She also brings up that maybe Congress was actually trying to stop this type of very lawsuit that is being brought by the nation of Mexico. Now, this position was also supported by Justice Thomas, who questions, how is this lawsuit different from the type of cases that were brought before the PLCA and then actually resulted in the PLCA being passed into law. Justice Jackson was also skeptical of just because manufacturers get ATF trace reports, that doesn't show an actual violation of the law on the part of the manufacturers. Statutory language requires more on the part of the manufacturers, and so Justice Jackson was saying, don't you need more to bring this type of lawsuit? Now, there were some other things that were brought up, like broader concerns and implications about, if this lawsuit is allowed to proceed forward, wouldn't that open other industries up to similar types of lawsuits? This was brought up by Justice Gorsuch, where he expresses concerns about kind of opening the floodgates when it comes to aiding and abetting and that type of liability for other industries. Justice Alito also brought this up, where he was talking about, the beer companies where maybe they're selling to college towns in a higher volume because they know that they are using those, and maybe some sort of liability can come out of that because it's foreseeable and they're targeting that area. So there was a lot of questions about some of the broader concerns, opening the door for other manufacturers and other industries. Now, one of the funny parts of this whole argument that I want to point out had to do with the whole marketing and characteristics arguments that the nation of Mexico brought up. And in some ways, it kind of backfired on the nation of Mexico. Mexico made allegations that certain firearms are made, marketed, and sold by these companies with the sole purpose of targeting criminals and cartels. Justice Alito brought up, isn't this a strange position that Mexico is kind of putting forward? And maybe it's just the fact that these companies are making firearms and selling them to a population that likes these types of firearms with these types of characteristics, and they want to use them. Mexico tries to say, well, only, criminals and the drug cartels want these types of, items, when that's not true. There are plenty of law-abiding people that like these types of firearms. Now, there's a lot more that happened during these arguments, but I think that gives you a good understanding of some of the fundamental issues and some of the topics that were raised during the oral arguments. Now, if you're going to ask my prediction, I think that this is at least going to be a 7-2 decision in favor of dismissing this lawsuit, because the gun manufacturers really cannot be tied to aiding and abetting like the nation of Mexico is actually claiming in this lawsuit. It could be unanimous. I wouldn't be surprised if it was unanimous, because at multiple points, every single justice was very critical and skeptical of the positions being raised by the nation of Mexico. Now, one wrinkle I would say is the whole proximate cause question. That might be avoided altogether by the Supreme Court here, kind of leaving open the door for future lawsuits, maybe against FFLs and dealers. And maybe there could be lawsuits brought up, because this is avoided and not addressed in this lawsuit, where maybe there's allegations that these FFLs and dealers knowingly are engaging in straw purchases and therefore could be held liable for some sort of criminal conduct despite what the PLCA says. So that's one of the things that we're also going to be looking forward in the decision to see how they address that. I think they're probably going to try to avoid it altogether. So again, this is a very important case. At stake in this lawsuit is whether or not the gun industry can be essentially sued into oblivion. And I do think that this lawsuit will ultimately be dismissed by the Supreme Court. So that's just some of my general takeaways. I recommend, if you want, go listen to the oral arguments. It's about about like an hour and a half long. A lot of things were brought up during the oral arguments, but I think that gives you a good understanding of some of the main topics and maybe what's going to happen going forward. So as we get more information, as things develop, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm, and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of two-way news. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.